If you stood at the foot of Market Street today, looking out towards the bay, you'd see San Francisco's Ferry Building, with its clock tower raising above the Embarcadero like it's always belonged there. For decades, this iconic structure was buried behind a double-decker freeway, its arches hidden, its interior gutted, and its legacy nearly forgotten. The building that once welcomed tens of thousands of people a day had become a storage facility for bureaucracy, blocked off from the very city that it once served. In fact, things got so bad that at one point there was a real plan to demolish it entirely. Which leaves me to ask the question, how did it survive? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover the rise and fall of the San Francisco Ferry Building. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. San Francisco was not always a city, but the moment that gold was discovered in the area, everything changed. Before the gold rush, it was called Yerba Buena, which was little more than a coastal settlement on the edge of Spanish and then Mexican territory. The harbor was deep and calm, but the place itself was little more than a military post and a mission, though that would change almost overnight. You see, by 1849, the waterfront swelled with tents, timber, and opportunists. In fact, the shoreline was so crowded with ships that some were permanently abandoned, left to rot, or repurposed as bay fill. Not to mention, there was also the issue of getting across the bay, which for citizens meant hopping on whatever could float. Small boats, skiffs, and makeshift ferries did the job, but only barely. Hence, as traffic picked up and the railroads pushed west, San Francisco's future started leaning towards something more permanent. In 1875, the city put up its first official ferry terminal, which was a long wooden structure at the foot of Market Street, with 3 slips and a central clock tower. It was called the Union Depot and Ferry House, and for a while it worked, and over time it evolved. It began with just 3 ferry slips, with 2 of the ferry slips serving the Central Pacific and the other the South Pacific Railway. As ferry demand increased, more sheds were added, eventually forming a kind of rambling single-story structure with a central clock tower for coordination. Despite its improvised nature, the terminal was a vital connection point. From there, passengers could board steam trains, cable cars, or horse carriages that branched into the city, making it a key hub in the growing urban transit web. The ferries ran regular routes to places like Oakland, Alameda, and so on, connecting San Francisco to the East Bay and beyond. At its peak, the wooden depot helped funnel passengers arriving via transcontinental rail lines, which terminated across the bay. People and freight flowed in by the millions back then, but the structure wasn't built for that scale. It cracked under the weight of traffic, and I'm not really exaggerating here. Have a look at an image of this building. Imagine that structure accommodated up to an estimated 50 million passengers a year, making it one of the busiest terminals in the world at the time. Even so, by the 1890s, that was not enough anymore. The depot had become a bottleneck, too small, too chaotic, and fragile for the kind of city that San Francisco really wanted to be. With ferry traffic surging and the city booming as the West financial and commercial capital, planners decided it was time to build something more monumental and something permanent. By the 1890s, San Francisco had outgrown its waterfront entirely. The city was moving goods, people, and capital on a scale unmatched anywhere else on the West Coast, and its ferry infrastructure in particular hadn't kept pace. That old timber depot at the foot of Market Street was crumbling, crowded, and increasingly unfit for the volume of passengers crossing the bay. In 1892, the California State Board of Harbor Commissioners approved a new terminal. They appointed architect A. Page Brown to lead the design. Brown had previously trained in New York with McKin, Mead, and White and studied classical architecture in Paris. And the first thing he did in the name of this project was travel back to Europe to study waterfront terminals and civic towers. Among the structures he examined was the Gibraltar Bell Tower, as well as Charing Cross Station in London. His intent was not to copy them, but to understand how monumental design could serve a city's practical needs while expressing its identity. This new terminal would also stand at the foot of Market Street, which at that time was cemented as the city's central axis. It would face the bay like a statement. Officials saw a structure that could rival the great public works of the East Coast and Europe. Remember, San Francisco was a city emerging from the gold rush into a position of prominence. Its ferry building needed to reflect that shift. And so it was. Construction began in 1895. The site sat on landfill and bay mud, so the foundation required 111 concrete piles driven deep into the ground. The building was framed in steel and timber, only to be clad in sandstone quarried from Colusa County. A vaulted hall ran the full length of the second floor and was illuminated by clear-story windows. Below it, the main concourse handled a daily surge of commuters and cargo. The layout was symmetrical, and the circulation was logical. Every piece of this structure was built to serve a working port. Anyhow, sadly, during the course of construction, Brown died unexpectedly in 1896, before the project was complete. Supervision passed first to Edward R. Swain and then to Willis Polk. They followed Brown's plans closely, and construction was mostly uneventful until the day finally came that this glorious building was complete. The ferry building opened for full service on July the 13th, 1898. The first ferry to dock at the new slips was the Piedmont, arriving that morning to deliver passengers into a terminal that was now the largest public building in the city. There was no grand ceremony, but the opening marked a clear change in how San Francisco met its bay. The building quickly became the region's central transportation hub. Ferries crossed the bay constantly, connecting San Francisco with the same destinations as before, in addition to points much further north. And on busy days, more than 170 boats came and went. Inside, the long nave was filled with travelers heading into the city by street or cable car, only to mostly come back later that same day, both of which were available thanks to a loop track in front of the terminal that let passengers transfer directly between modes. We should also point out that the ferry building wasn't only used for transit, it also served as a civic space. There were countless events here. Soldiers returning home from war paraded through its concourse, and even presidents passed through here. For example, in 1903, Theodore Roosevelt arrived here by ferry and was welcomed before riding up Market Street. Later, in 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed through the building during his visit to San Francisco. Now, the second floor's nave was sometimes used for events and receptions. Its placement at the base of Market Street made it a natural threshold between the waterfront and the rest of the city. However, just 7 years after this masterpiece opened, San Francisco would face one of the most destructive events in its short history. On April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., the ferry building was shaken by a massive earthquake. The force stopped the clock. Cracks formed in the tower, and windows shattered throughout the building. The masonry suffered a minor failure and the tile roof was damaged, but unlike much of the city, the structure actually remained intact. Hence, it reopened within days and served as a rallying point during the fire and the destruction that followed. The tower was eventually repaired, and the cracked terracotta was patched, and it seemed that the general consensus was that its survival gave the city a physical anchor at a time when almost everything else was gone. From there, the building continued to operate at full capacity throughout the 1920s and well into the 1930s, but change was coming. The Bay Bridge opened in 1936, and then the Golden Gate Bridge followed in 1937. With cars now able to cross the bay, ferry traffic began to decline. By the end of the Second World War, ridership had dropped sharply. Though the system was still running, the city no longer depended on it. But then came the ultimate disgrace, the Embarcadero Freeway. Sometimes called San Francisco's Freeway to Nowhere, the Embarcadero Freeway is a story in its own right, which is why we made a video about it some years back, which you can watch after this episode by clicking the card right here. Construction of the Embarcadero Freeway began in 1953. Its purpose was to link the Bay Bridge to the Golden Gate Bridge, running above San Francisco's northeast shoreline. And unfortunately, that route passed directly in front of the ferry building. When the first segment opened in 1959, it rose just yards from the building's face, effectively severing it from Market Street. From that point on, the ferry building was no longer a part of the city's visual identity. The tower was obscured, pedestrian access was complicated, and the noise of vehicles echoed across what had once been the city's ceremonial plaza. Now, believe it or not, transit planners at the time considered this progress, part of a large movement to turn San Francisco into a city shaped by automobiles. And the impact on the ferry building was not only symbolic, but it was immediate and lasting. Inside, the transformation had also begun. In 1950, the Port of San Francisco converted sections of the second floor into general office space. To accomplish that, infill was added to block off the open nave. Public counters were removed, windows were covered, and a type of cultural decay set in, to the point that by the mid-1960s, the building had become an entirely office-based structure. A structure that most San Franciscans had no reason to go inside. The surrounding waterfront fared no better. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the piers along the Embarcadero also slipped into decline. The shipping industry had shifted to container ports across the bay in Oakland, whereas the ferry traffic had almost dried up entirely. The once active piers sat underused, fenced off, or vacant. And now, the ferry building's granite steps led to a tangle of crosswalks and traffic lights beneath the dark underside of a freeway overpass. This shoreline, which had once served as San Francisco's defining edge, became a space that people didn't even want to pass through. Efforts to renovate the freeway were raised as early as the 1960s, but were blocked repeatedly, most notable of which happened in 1985 when Mayor Dianne Feinstein vetoed a measure that would have begun its dismantling. You see, this freeway had always been controversial. Originally envisioned as a grand waterfront connector, it never reached the Golden Gate Bridge as planned. Construction was halted in 1959 after intense local opposition, leaving the structure as a dead-end spur that funneled traffic into the downtown core, but offered no exit beyond Broadway. It was elevated, intrusive, and disconnected from the rest of the city's highway system. For drivers, it created congestion. For pedestrians, it created a barrier. Critics called it the freeway to nowhere, not just for where it stopped, but for what it disrupted. With that in mind, neighborhood groups, architects, and planners pushed for its removal throughout the 1960s and 70s. They argued that the freeway destroyed the connection between the city and its waterfront, undermined real estate value, and the Embarcadero itself. And if those things weren't bad enough, it also isolated public landmarks like the Ferry Building. But as the pressure grew, the city held back, afraid that removing it would snarl traffic and anger commuters. At this point, the Ferry Building had been listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but the designation didn't translate into attention or even care. It remained largely inaccessible and increasingly ignored. But then the turning point came. Not from city planners, but from Mother Earth, once again. On October the 17th, 1989, at 5:04 p.m., the Loma Prieta earthquake struck the Bay Area. Sections of the Embarcadero Freeway were damaged. This time, there would be no repair. The structure was closed the same day, and its demolition plans were drafted within months. Demolition of the Embarcadero Freeway began in February of 1999. It had been closed since the earthquake in October, when several sections near Broadway were visibly damaged. Structural engineers determined that retrofitting the viaduct would be too cost-prohibitive. Public opposition to rebuilding was also widespread, leading the Board of Supervisors to vote 6-5 in approval of its removal. The Ferry Building, located directly alongside the freeway's alignment, had sustained only minor damage from the earthquake, yet again, with some walls cracked and windows shattered. But the steel-reinforced structure remained sound. As it was in 1906, the building had endured a major seismic event with its core integrity intact. However, what had now changed was the landscape around it. With the freeway gone, the Ferry Building was once again connected to the city, but that visibility didn't immediately translate into renewed relevance. Ferry service had not been fully discontinued, but by the early 1990s, it had dwindled to just a few commuter lines serving the East Bay. Inside the building, most of the space was still dedicated to administrative offices. It had no retail presence or no role in public life. However, things would change. In 1992, the Port of San Francisco began work on a waterfront redevelopment plan. The Ferry Building was identified as a key site, though its future was uncertain. Public design workshops followed in 1993. Architects, preservationists, and city planners debated on how the building could be adapted without compromising its historical integrity. Ultimately, they did reach a consensus. By 1998, a full restoration and reuse plan was approved. The second-floor nave would be restored, the ground level would be converted into a public market, and the upper floors would remain office space to support the building's long-term financial stability. Authorities were acting fast, and reconstruction began that very same year. The nave's vaulted ceiling was reopened, post-war partitions were removed, and that beautiful mosaic tile floor, partially intact beneath layers of linoleum, was restored using original and salvaged materials. And so it was the ferry building reopened to the public in 2003. Ferry service, which had continued in a limited form, was formally reintegrated into the terminal, now alongside a ground floor market that emphasized local food and regional products, meaning for the first time in generations, the building operated with both economic purpose and public access. We'll leave it there for today, but for more San Francisco history, you should check out our entire California playlist. It's got many gems, so you can click right here and watch that. Otherwise, I hope you'll consider subscribing, and as always, I'm Ryan Socash. Until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.